how many people were killed for being Christian? It was huge. And we don't even begin to think about this living in a place like Canada, but they died in their millions. But they did it happily. Some of them even had a sense of humor in the process. Polycarp, who was 80 when they murdered him, they decided they wanted him to give up his faith, so they decided to put him on the barbecue. That's how they killed him, basically. And he had enough sang-froid, whatever you want to call it, that at one point he said, "I think I'm done on that side, you can turn me over." Those are our heroes, because, of course, the promise is that when the worst comes, you will not be alone. And, of course, that's what actually converted the Mediterranean world to Christianity, that Christ turned up. And the stories went around the world. I could do the next hour on those stories, but that's not what I said I would do today. The difference between Islam and Christianity is precisely that. Christianity conquered the Mediterranean basin by dying the death of martyrs and demonstrating love to other people. "Behold how these people love one another," was the first comment about Christians. And I've had some sense of that in this church. And I have a great deal of, what's the word I want even? Obligations, yes. Thanks, yes. For living in places that are very poor and realizing what a wonderful gift Christianity has been. You need to go and live in places where there's nothing like it to begin to realize what we have, and hence slowly to be drawn into talking about it properly. I remember once, for instance, I gave a lecture in the University of St. Petersburg in Russia between 5 and 6 at the end of the day for students. Fortunately, my wife was with me. She's always more sensible than me. And she quickly realized that, yes, there were some good English speakers, but some of them were not so good. So she took charge for a moment or two and organized them so that they were in groups that had a good English speaker, and she made me stop every 5 minutes or so, and they could check that they'd got it right. And so it was a slow lecture. After about an hour and a half, I'd got through what I intended to do in 40 minutes. But then they said, "Can we ask questions?" And again, my wife wisely intervened. She said, "Write your questions down and bring them to me, and then we can check if this is really the question you want to ask, and then we'll pass them to John." That question period lasted for 5 hours. Can you imagine that? And they only stopped then because they wanted to get the last train home. I said to one Russian student, "What was the worst thing about growing up under the communists?" And she said, "They destroyed the meaning of the word trust. You can't run a society without trust. And we now are going in the same direction, which is one of the things that pulled me out of my ivory tower. We no longer trust one another as we used to. And when you don't have trust, you have to increase rules. But rules are blunt instruments, and they will destroy society. We now have in the Canadian medical system more bureaucrats than we have doctors and nurses. That's ridiculous, but that's where we've got to. And it's people who don't know what they're doing trying to control us. Now, I turned out to be only fit to be an academic, so I spent all my life in the university, apart from the time I spent in Africa, which was about a year in the first instance, and then every year for about 2 or 3 months. There's a very interesting quirk for academics, if there are any in the audience. You probably noticed it said associate professor. That's quite correct. I have about 180 publications, so why not full professor? Because I hate bureaucracy. So I went to the dean and said, "Can I have a deal?" you have spent some money in our department that you shouldn't have spent, and you were always on to us to hire women, and we kept telling you we hire biochemists. I just had a graduate student come back from Cambridge with a PhD, and so she fitted his bill as well as ours. She was very good, and he wasn't hiring her. And I said, what's the trouble? And he said, well, I've spent the money, and so I can't hire her at the moment. I don't have enough to hire her. I said, how much are you short? And he told me, and I said, you can take that from my salary and I'll take the time because I'm going to close my laboratory. He wasn't happy about that. I'll continue teaching for the moment, but I don't think I'm going to stay around the university that long. But I will be disappearing for 1 day a week, and I'll take 2 months in Africa every year. He said, I'm glad about Africa because I was already taking students to Africa, and he said, it's a very good experience for them. When I first went to Africa and got back, the students all wanted a lecture because most people on the sabbaticals go and look at another bit of DNA or a protein or something that is really not interesting to them. But going to the most primitive parts of the world was interesting. And my wife had taken pictures, so he gave a talk. And at the end of the talk, 2 girls came forward and said, will you take us to Africa with you? I said, I don't think I'm going back. And they said, your wife is. They'd got female intuition. I knew they were right as well. And I said, what would you do for me? And they said, anything you want. Now, my academic interest that took me to Africa was the treatment of 10-pound 2-year-olds, if you can imagine such things, birth weight at 2 years of age. And I'd spent 7 years working on that project paid for by the Wellcome Trust in Jamaica. And we'd succeeded, so that when I left Jamaica in 1979, we went through 100 10-pound 2-year-olds or worse and saved every single one. I'd still yet to go to a mission hospital that's doing it right. And the average mom couldn't bring herself to do it because what you think is good nutrition actually kills a baby at that point. Protein is poisonous initially. And getting to the point where it ceases to be poisonous is the art form. So we'd published the stuff, and it made no difference in Africa. You see, our universities and our world thinks everything is a problem of information. Hence, the university is passing information. But that's not true. The information was there, but there's a cultural base that has to be there for information to be put into practice, and an ethical structure that has to be there. And that is fading fast. In fact, the first time I went to Africa, against my will, it's another story, you couldn't write it as fiction, because nobody would believe it, but it happened. I put 6 barriers in the way, and they were removed one by one. And so we went, and my wife and children went. They were pressuring to go anyway. And that was 1987. And that was the year a book was published called The Closing of the American Mind. And it was published by a Jewish man, the best teacher of Aristotle and Plato at the University of Chicago in the 50s and 60s. A radical homosexual, an activist. He seduced his students. But he was a very, very good scholar. And by 1980, the mid-80s, the students who were arriving from high school in North America were not up to snuff. The standards were dropping, and they've continued to drop ever since. And he didn't like doing remedial training. In fact, he wasn't willing to do it. So he wrote The Closing of the American Mind. And here's an unbelieving Jew who wanted every student in his class to be familiar with the Bible, Old and New Testament. Why? Because we can only talk to one another effectively with metaphors. And those metaphors are largely, or to a great degree anyway in the Western world, biblical. And when we don't know the story anymore, we get to the point where students are at now, where I can speak to them a whole sentence and they will know every word in the sentence and not the meaning. I often got asked to do a talk in Frosh Week, because they could be vaguely amusing and interesting and ironic. And I would say to the medical students, you are going to be taught medicine using the biopsychosocial model of medicine. As far as I'm concerned, that model has been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and my guess is that no more than one of you know what I've just said. Raise your hand if you know what I've said. Yeah, I think I said this at the weekend at some point, but he would have got it anyway. But if you don't recognize the metaphor, you don't understand the meaning. What should have come into your mind is Belshazzar's feast, the writing on the wall. Nobody knew where it was, and when hands write in the wall, even if you're drunk, it upsets you. So they sent for Daniel, who said, the words mean that you and your kingdom, King Belshazzar, have been weighed in the balances and found wanting, not up to weight. And you will be dead, and your kingdom will be gone in the morning. And we know the date it happened. I wasn't saying the way we teach medicine now, the biopsychosocial model, was a few grams underweight, which is what the students thought. I was saying that it is profanely and profoundly inadequate. And I'm right. What to do about it? We get bioethicists who are lapdogs to industry, as you saw with the disgraceful way that the government protected the manufacturers of the COVID vaccines from any consequences to the fact that they didn't go through the appropriate safety checks. Money talked. So that book, as I read it, upset me. Only the first chapter is really worth reading, but towards the end of that first chapter, Alan Bloom allows himself a few moments of reminiscence. And he says this, he's looking at his family history. He's a third-generation Jew in America. His grandparents arrived with nothing. They worked in the sweatshops. His parents owned the sweatshops. And as he says, I and my cousins are all MDs and PhDs. The classic Jewish success story. Not rare, normal. And there are good reasons for that. The Muslims haven't won a Hard Nobel Prize in 20 years. I mean the real ones, not the silly ones like peace, the real ones like physics or medicine or physiology, biochemistry. Because their culture won't support it. But that's a whole other lecture. But he says this, he writes, my grandparents were humble folk. They never went inside an institution of higher learning, but everything done in their home was spiritually rich. They found reasons for the performance of their duties and the bearing of their sorrows by reference to the book. Note it's reasons, not feelings. We've got to come to this in a minute. And they could go to the synagogue where they heard not, nice fuzzy talks, but great scholars who spoke not from an alien perspective, but from the same perspective as theirs, while simply going deeper and providing guidance. That, says Bloom, and it's the best definition of community I know, that is what a community is, something that invites high and low into a common story of meaning. We don't have it anymore. He goes on, the next sentence blew me away completely. He said, when I look at my cousins, all of whom have been educated in the American way, they have no wisdom compared to that of my grandparents. And in fact, I ask students all the while, I have not met a student in the last 5 or 10 years who's ever felt at the end of a day in university that they're wiser than they were at the beginning of the day. Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? T.S. Eliot in the 1930s. He was right. Now you do memorize and dump, don't you? None of you could pass the exam you took in university, even if it was only a few months ago, because within minutes of leaving the examination room, you started to forget. Because you never learned in the first place. Because we didn't teach in the first place. What's gone wrong? Well, the thing that happened next was extraordinary, the sort of thing that only God can do. I got back from Africa on that trip, and I somehow said to medical students in my class, I said, if Alan Bloom is right, you're a bunch of ignoramuses. Now, this was the 1980s, they were still polite. If you said it today, there'd be a riot. But then there wasn't. But about 20 of them came and said, you have no right to call us ignorant, and you ought to apologize. I said, well, first of all, it wasn't me, it was Alan Bloom, and he's not here to apologize, and I have no intention of doing so. But we are a quasi-experimental faculty, so why don't we do the test? And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, Alan Bloom says if you don't know the Bible, you can't get educated in the Western way properly, even if you don't believe. And so I said, you all think Gandhi was the greatest thing since sliced bread. So he thought the Sermon on the Mount was the greatest piece of writing he'd ever read. So tell me how it starts and what it says. Zip, nothing. And I said, well, there you are. He's right. You're ignorant. And then, bless them, they changed my life with the next sentence, because I wasn't student-friendly. I didn't have any time for students. And they said, what are you going to do about it? And I said, precisely nothing. It's your problem, not mine. And they said, but you claim to know something we ought to know. Why wouldn't you teach us? I said, I'm busy. They said, but this is important. And my mother turned up at the back of my head, and I said, well, you don't even know the questions, let alone the answers. You need an Agnostics Anonymous group. That just came off the tip of my tongue. So AA was born on the spot. But it wasn't Alcoholics Anonymous, it was Agnostics Anonymous, people who don't know all the important questions. And the only prerequisite I made was that you couldn't claim to be a Christian. And I got a quarter of the class every year for the next few years. Christians crept in after we got started, but they were not allowed to speak. It was very interesting. I enjoyed it. I only know one who became a Christian directly as a result of it, but they all left saying, my goodness, we've not been educated properly. And the Bible's part of it, an important part of it. But as I walked away, I realized I couldn't pass my own test. I could dredge up bits of the Sermon on the Mount, but I couldn't give a coherent account. Now, don't ever want to be a professor, because if you want to be a professor, it will be hell. You have to be asked to be a professor, because if you're made to do it, it's fun. If you're not, it's terrible. Because we're very quirky. We're not much used in many situations, but we have one real vice. We love the sound of our own voice. And secondly, most of us have superb memories, which are a gift. We shouldn't claim them. So I used to go to biochemistry lectures for medical students with the wrong notes, just to keep myself awake. I didn't need lectures. I didn't need notes to teach biochemistry to medical students. It was a waste of time anyway, because they wouldn't remember it. And the only bit they did remember would be the Krebs cycle, and if you don't have a Krebs cycle, you're dead, so it has no practical value whatsoever. But we've got to the stage where real learning is not valued, because we send far too many people to university, and we take the money of most of them for no benefit. If I if I had the power, and I could change the education system tomorrow, only 3% of people would be allowed to go to university. The others would have to go to work and learn something they wanted to do and make, and then they might go to special courses that would take their careers on, and they would enjoy the whole thing much more. But that's not the way it's going to go, because there's so many vested interests out there. But I couldn't do that with the Sermon on the Mount. And I felt guilty. I'd also come across, I think it's Bonhoeffer's advice, that if your Christian life is a bit flat, a bit dull, you need to ask God to give you a passage of Scripture from Him to you in a personal way. It may be only a verse to some of you. For me, it was 3 chapters, the Sermon on the Mount. And what you do then is, first of all, you memorize it, and then you start thinking about it. Now, that was 1987. I can honestly say at this stage, I don't go through a 24-hour period in which the Sermon on the Mount doesn't appear in my mind at some point. That's how powerful it has become, the core of who I am. All my colleagues in the academic world, when I started doing this sort of traveling, I said, what do I do when they ask me to preach, for instance? I say, well, that's a no-brainer. It's boring for you, but you've got 2 talks you have to give straight away before you're allowed to give any others. And this is the variance of it, of course. I've got to keep myself awake. Now, with this, I don't have any problem. So, the first thing I realized, of course, is what an amazing sermon it is for doctors, because the introduction to it, I know that none of you could tell me the Beatitudes, for instance, in sequence. Well, it's very unlikely. But at the end of chapter 4, Jesus, on the Sabbath, as soon as the sun set, he starts healing people. Lots of them. Next morning he wakes up and he looks out, and there's a crowd there already, just like it would be in Africa now. Now, Jesus does one thing that I can't do. He said, I do nothing except what the Father says to me. And undoubtedly he said, Father, what do I do today? And he said, go and teach. Aren't we glad that he did? All the people that Jesus ever healed died. But if he hadn't taught us the Sermon on the Mount, our world wouldn't be as it is today. I was in the place where it's supposed to have happened, and I could believe it. I could see it in my mind's eye. And how many of you watched The Chosen? Quite a lot, yeah. I love I think, brilliant stroke to make Matthew a sort of mildly autistic guy, obsessive compulsive. Perfect. Because Matthew puts his conversion after the Sermon on the Mount. So I think the Sermon on the Mount is his conversion story. I think this is artistic license on my part, but I think that Matthew probably tried to rip Jesus off, or did rip him off, because he could take whatever he wanted. And for once, instead of people getting cross with him, Jesus looked at him with pity, and he never forgot that. So when he heard this strange carpenter had become, in his terms, a traveling rabbi, there was no way he was not going to go and find out more. I think he said to his hirelings, you can rip me off today, I've taught you how to do it. I'm going to see what this guy's doing. I like to imagine him arriving at the village where he knew he was, and nobody's there. Except the old people. They say, oh, look at that over there, they're going up the hillside. So he had to run. I like to think of him getting there just a bit out of breath, or a lot out of breath, because he's been living a self-indulgent life. But his life is meaningless, and he knows it. And the first words he hears are, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The first step to real blessedness, real happiness, is poverty of spirit. Now, as a professor, immediately these are aphorisms. This is not the Sermon on the Mount as it was given. This is Matthew's account of the Sermon on the Mount. The aphorism, I'm sure, is there. But it had to be developed in an oral setting. You can leave it like that. He's crying out for development. What on earth does he mean? It's not apparent what he means, is it? And the way you do it now is you compare Scripture with Scripture. And when you start doing this, it's not too long, if you're reasonably scholarly, to realize that, for instance, the book of James is a commentary on the Sermon on the Mount. It's the easiest way to understand it. But I think he said something like this. He said, if you take your own soul seriously, imagine I could now go, whap, and you've all got a bubble over your head, right? Like a cartoon character. And all your thoughts can be read by everyone else. And that bubble's going to stay there for the next week. What are you going to do? Go and find a lawyer? We couldn't live with that, could we? We don't even like to look in our own souls because it's not nice. but it's the truth. And Jesus says the start of a culture that is going to work is going to start with that proposition. After all, the fall is the first real event after creation, isn't it? That's who we are. We can screw up even in the best of situations. And Jesus says that's what you start with. Face the reality. You're a mess. We're all a mess. And then he says, but yours is the kingdom. Doesn't look like it at first sight, does it? But the moment you become genuinely honest, that's what happens. Now, how quickly it happens is another issue. One of my best friends is also one of the best journalists in Canada, writes for the National Post regularly, and now teaches at Augustine College. We met 30 years ago. He came to cover a lecture I gave in Ottawa, and as he left, he said to the only Christian journalist I knew in Ottawa, I enjoyed that, didn't expect to. And she said, would you like to meet him? He said, yes, as long as he doesn't know that. She said, I can arrange that. So she actually started a little reading group, the National Press Club, lunch reading group. And I was the only non-journalist invited. I got to know John. And of course, those reading groups last for a little while and they fade away, but we'd become friends. He was an atheist, a PhD in history, spoke several languages fluently. I was a PhD in biochemistry, a physician. I didn't speak several languages fluently, despite the attempts people had made to teach me in the past. But we both loved arguing. We argued for 20 years. Every now and again, every few months, we'd have lunch together, and I introduced him to a lot of good people, and he introduced me to a lot of good people. And then one Saturday, I bought an Ottawa Citizen. I don't normally buy them. This is Providence again. And he'd written an opinion piece, and not his usual thing, a different one. And it was called, Why Taking History Seriously Can Make You Very Cross. I said to him later, you should rewrite that and call it Why Taking the Cross Seriously Can Make You Very Cross, because that's even more true. But it began roughly like this. He said, the Eastern Mediterranean at the time of Christ was not an ignorant backwater, but where Greek learning, Roman pragmatism, and Jewish theology met, some fishermen, a tax collector, a man who had a seizure on the road to Damascus, persuaded their neighbors and then the whole Jewish empire, the whole Roman Empire, that a dead Jewish carpenter was God. How weird is that? And this God didn't prance around using his power, but he allowed his creatures to nail him to a stick on a dunghill, and that changed the history of the world. This is a PhD in history who understands clearly that the world changed when Christ died and rose again. Not just for individuals, but as a culture. There were no hospitals before. There were all the things that we love grew out of that. The person who's done this best in the recent past is Tom Holland. Read his Dominion. He became a Christian by writing popular history and realizing that everything he loved did not come from the Greeks and the Romans. He's a Christian now. So the moment you become honest, Christ stands out. It's happening to Jordan Peterson now. He's not quite there yet. He's getting close. I happened to meet him just before he became famous. My wife organizes everything that happens in my life. So when people started asking me to go teach all over the place, she took over. And so she said, there's an invitation to X or Y like this one. And I said yes to this immediately, and I don't know why. It's not what I usually do. But this one was for a Catholic family conference in Seattle, and it was Catholic ones are interesting. I have different conversations. So I said, I'll say yes, that sounds interesting. Didn't know who was coming or anything like that, but shortly we discovered what it was all about. And it was because an American physician who was concerned about the young people in their church and a few other people, the material for young people that the Catholic Church was putting out at that time didn't get under their skin, but apparently Jordan Peterson and I did. So that's why we were invited. I knew that Peterson was having trouble at Toronto, and that's about as much as I knew. So I heard him he was on first on the first evening, and I was duly impressed. The next morning, he was on second, I was on first, and at that point, and still, he has a crazy diet. He's not a well man, and he often doesn't listen to other people, not because he doesn't want to, but because he needs to lie down if he's going to do an hour's lecture. He doesn't have that much energy, really. It's amazing what he does. But the good Lord took a role in this, because I don't stay in hotels if I can possibly avoid them. They're dangerous. I like to stay with families whenever possible. And I was staying with a Catholic family. And at breakfast, if you know me, you wouldn't be entirely surprised, but we got into vigorous discussion at breakfast even. And then suddenly my hostess said, "Oh dear, you're on in 2 minutes and we're half an hour away." So she called the organisers and said, "I'm sorry, but it's my fault, but John Patrick won't be here for half an hour." And the Irishman who answered said, "Oh, it's all right. We've got two groups of people we didn't expect. A group of young men who've all come to listen to Jordan Peterson, and a group of medical students who've all come to listen to John Patrick. So they're getting to know one another. So we'll just push everything back half an hour." Which meant that Jordan Peterson walked in immediately after I'd started, so he had to listen to me. And afterwards he said some nice things, and we got to know one another a bit. And he actually said, "I'll come and see you next time I'm driving up to Ottawa, because I'm going to be going next to your farm." But of course, within a week or two, the Kathy Newman affair occurred, and he was going to 80 countries in a year. But even at that stage, he said, "This is extraordinarily moving." I mean, the first book he wrote would be common sense to anybody who's Christianly educated. And yet it sold, because young men in particular out of there thought it was something new. And he said, they come up to me and say, "You Jordan Peterson?" And I say, "Yes." And they say, "May I shake your hand? You changed my life for the better." And I'll tell you, there's nothing that comes close to that kind of response. To realize that you've been sucked into something much bigger than yourself. It happens to me every now and again.